Hello and welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. I am your editor and producer, Other Jacob. Today we have Tobias Harris, the starting forward on the Detroit Pistons. He's going to talk to us about the geopolitics of Japan. That's all I got. We're going to dive in. Go tell your loved ones that you love them. Go touch some grass, and we'll see you out there.
Really pleased to welcome the starting forward on the Detroit Pistons. Oh, wait, sorry. I got the wrong. Can somebody get me the right bio over here? I thought about doing a Zach Galifianakis between two ferns and just treating you like the Detroit Pistons Tobias Harris the whole time. I thought that would have been funny. It's good to see you, man. Thanks for making the time to come on.
No, it's great to be back. Thanks, Jacob.
We will throw this in the show notes. The last time Tobias came on, I was not yet a subscriber to his Substack, Observing Japan. I am now, and I can attest it's as good as you might expect it to be from the last time he was on. So I appreciate Tobias making the time. We could start in a lot of different places, but we should probably start in the obvious place, which is Liberation Day. United States tariffs, not just on enemies, but on allies, including Japan. And it wasn't, see if I characterize this correctly. It seems to me that in some sense, the biggest negative reaction to U.S. tariffs and the protectionist impulse in U.S. trade policy in some ways has not been China or Europe. It has been Japan, which has basically said, we're not signing on to anti-China provisions, and we expect the rollback of all of these tariffs. You've had, 5 trade meetings now between the United States and Japan. It seemed like the last one didn't go anywhere, that there's no agreement on just about anything between the two sides. Where are Japan-U.S. relations at? Because from somebody who is not focused on Japan all the time, it seems like Japan is basically saying to the United States, like, we're not going along with you. And that's pretty shocking because there's arguably no country in the world that is more dependent on U.S. security, that is closer to the United States outside of the Five Eyes in Japan. And it looks like relations are not particularly good. So am I overcharacterizing it?
Well, this situation in some ways is a worse nightmare for Japan because, of course, as you noted, they depend on the United States for its security, and more than that, they want, the goal of central goal of Japanese foreign policy for a long time now has been keeping the United States engaged in what we now call the Indo-Pacific. Economically, politically, militarily. That if the U.S. is not engaged and committed, that Japan's security will be detrimental. It'll be extremely detrimental for Japan's security. So on all those scores, that has been Japan's main goal. And the fact that you now have a U.S. administration that not only is reconsidering that long-standing commitment, but now is essentially asking a higher price to be paid by Japan and other U.S. allies to keep doing things that it was doing. It just puts Japan in such an uncomfortable situation. And of course, for Japanese companies, the United States is, an exceedingly important market. Japan invests a lot in the United States. It's something that, frankly, they just would prefer not to have to deal with. But they do have red lines, so they can't just say, well, we're going to do anything to keep the U.S. happy, because ultimately there are prices that Japan does not feel comfortable paying. And so that's really where things are stuck right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's also some level, I think, of consternation on the Japanese side, because if you believe the U.S. reporting on this, like, the U.S. doesn't even really know what it wants from Japan. I thought you laid out really well, there's the Stephen Mirren approach, and then there's what the United States is actually doing, and then there's the reporting on that meeting where Greer and Lutnick and Besant are all in the meeting and have to pause the meeting because they don't agree on what they're asking from the Japanese side. So maybe some of this is just like Japan not quite understanding what it is the United States wants. What do you think the United States wants? Like, what do you think the United States is trying to get out of this? And what would be like, are there any concessions that Japan is going to be willing to make? Because I sort of read their current position as like, you guys are crazy, so come to us with a real ask, and sure, we can talk. But right now, this is bonkers. Like, we have nothing to work with.
Well, just as an aside so the reporting about the U.S. negotiators arguing with each other, that I believe came from Nikkei. which tells you it's clearly saying the Japanese government wanted out there. Like this is what we're dealing with in these talks. But and the article, at least the Japanese version of the article mentioned this, and I thought it was that was the first thing that came to mind, was that back in the 80s and 90s when you had serious long-standing friction between the U.S. and Japan. Japan didn't really have the equivalent of a USTR at that point, and so you had Japanese negotiators from different parts of the Japanese government doing that essentially. Almost the exact same scenes where you'd have the MITI guy arguing with the Ministry of Finance guy and the Foreign Ministry, and they'd be having arguments in front of the United States, where the U.S. actually did have a unified position in the course, represented by the USTR. And so it's a little funny to see the situation reversed, where actually heading into the TPP negotiations, one of the innovations Japan made, this was under Abe, was, we actually can't enter these talks and do it the way we used to do. We actually have to have our own sort of answer to USTR. And part of the reason why, the U.S. and Japan were actually able to overcome a lot of longstanding hurdles in those talks was that you did essentially have a U.S. trade representative negotiating with a Japan trade representative, and instead of having one side or the other start arguing amongst themselves on the other side of the table. And so now here we are full circle, and Japan is like, we wish we were negotiating with a single negotiator instead of, watching them negotiate amongst themselves. But that, in some ways that really is the fundamental problem, because it does seem that there are some really irreconcilable goals within the Trump administration, where you have, what sounds like, the Lutnick position, the Navarro position, where the goal really is the United States just needs to buy less stuff from foreigners, right? That is the goal. In which case, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of room to negotiate on a lot of these tariffs, where we're not, this is not like we're gonna raise our tariffs and then we're gonna negotiate with you for concessions, and ultimately the goal is to remove most of the tariffs so that but ultimately get some concessions out of you to give our producers more market access. That does not seem to be the thinking of a lot of people in the administration, versus someone like Bessent, who does, certainly at different times has suggested that the goal is to negotiate and ultimately to get better terms of access for U.S. producers in a foreign market. And so, one of those positions Japan can work with, Japan, if the goal is, okay, we'll give you some concessions and then you'll remove, some of these tariffs you're imposed. And then we say, great, we made a deal. We have a, stronger economic ties between our countries, and we can go forward. But if that's not the situation, there's not a lot. Japan's not going to just accept, 25% tariffs on its single largest category of exports to the United States. It's that is just such a red line. And now, of course, today, Trump comes out and says that auto tariffs are going to go even higher. I think that the important thing to note, and this is, I think, something that I have been personally frustrated with watching the Trump administration do trade policy, is that they either don't realize or don't care that other countries have domestic politics too. And so what we've seen over the course of these negotiations, as we've had successive rounds of U.S. Japan talks, has been Ishiba saying, these auto tariffs are absolutely unacceptable. We cannot sign on to an agreement that does not. The demand has been eliminate. I think now they're getting to a point where at least they have to be reduced. But the point is that if the Trump administration is not even willing to discuss them, and now they're talking about raising them even further, then there's no real basis for an agreement, because frankly, an agreement that doesn't have some concessions from the U.S. on automobile tariffs is not something that Japan is going to be able to sign on to. And it's certainly not something that Ishiba can sign on to without really paying a price domestically. And he has positioned himself so that he can't sign on to that without paying some price domestically.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that this has done fundamental and even irrevocable damage to U.S.-Japan relations? And if so, what does that look like 3 years from now, 5 years from now? Or is Japan in the category of countries like Canada, which okay, like, yes, it's rude and it's heavy handed and everything else, but you don't really have a choice but to go along because you're too exposed, either from a trade perspective or a security perspective or anything else. So take that one however you want.
Well, I mean, I guess maybe it's worth stepping back and saying for the moment that, things did not start on Liberation Day, right? I mean, Japan was very frustrated with, I mean, even before Trump was elected, with the politics of TPP in the United States and the fact that, we negotiated this thing and you can't even get it through Congress. So there's been frustration with rising protectionism in the United States now for, at least a decade. What exactly are you prepared to do has been the question, I think, from Japan as far as the United States is concerned. So they've already been living in a world where the reliability of the United States, at least as an economic partner, has been in serious doubt in Tokyo for a while. And they've already been thinking about how do we design and protect a rules-based international economic order on the basis of the United States is at best going to be an inconsistent partner. And also that was during the Biden years, right? Where, I think there was a lot of frustration that on the one, from one side of the mouth, they talked about friendshoring. And then on the other side of the mouth, you had, Biden opposing, Nippon Steel buying U.S. Steel. So, I mean, there's, this is not just about Trump. This is not something that began, in April. This is, really a longer term disenchantment and frustration with the United States really stepping back and pulling back from playing a rule making role both within Asia and also within the global economy. And so Japan's already been thinking about its plan Bs on that front. It's already viewed brought TPP back to life as part of that effort. It has drawn closer to the EU as part of that effort. Deepening ties with various countries in Southeast Asia, even viewing China as finding a way to live with China and continue to have an economic relationship with China, navigating U.S.-China frictions and the impact that has on Japan. And so Japan's already in this mindset of thinking about, okay, how do we navigate a world where the United States basically is sitting out a lot of efforts to integrate the global economy. So we're going to see that continue. There's already talk about how do you bring TPP and the EU closer together. So you're almost creating this kind of advanced set of global economic rules, kind of sidestepping the logjam at the WTO, sidestepping the US sitting things out. So we're already seeing that. The bigger question when it comes to the reliability of the United States is more on the security side. And do you see the kind of spillovers, or do you see the kind of actions from the Trump administration where Japan really says, we really don't feel like, the U.S. security guarantee is viable, is alive. There's been things, whether it's actions undertaken or that could be undertaken by Trump, or rhetoric. I mean, and at this point, a lot of that now is speculative. It's been on the back burner. I mean, clearly, trade is front of mind, and that's the main focus. But if there is reason down the road to really question the credibility of the U.S. security guarantee, then you're really going to see real change in Japan's approach, to its relationship with the United States, and really with it, then its approach to the world. But for the moment, it does seem that the trade issues are somewhat insulated from those broader questions.
All right, well, I'm going to do the bane of all analysts' existence. I know this because I am one. I'm going to ask you two different hypotheticals. The first is, okay, well, let's say the United States, hypothetically, says we're not going to defend Taiwan from China in the future. Like, what options does Japan have at that point? Or does that not even matter to them? Does the hypothetical have to be that the United States says we're not going to defend contested islands in the East China Sea or something like that are contested between Japan and China? Like, China can have those. Like, what happens in that scenario? Like, what options does Japan have?
Well, I mean, just to poke at that a little bit, I mean, I think the Taiwan the first part of the Taiwan issue in particular. I mean, presumably, if that's part of some sort of grand bargain with China, I mean, presumably it's not going to just be a unilateral declaration, but it's going to be, some sort of deal with Xi Jinping that says, we're dividing up the world into spheres of influence, and Taiwan is on your side of the line. So, so good luck. Of course, in theory, Japan's still not going to say, okay, U.S. go home. I mean, if part of that is, the U.S. is going to keep bases in Japan, and the line just happens to, be just east of Taiwan. That's one thing. I mean, I think Japan will be very unhappy about that because the sort of the geostrategists look at the map and they say if Taiwan is integrated into mainland China, it gives it just, I mean, as a physical threat to Japan, just where it moving China's naval presence that much further east, and having access to the Western Pacific, that is just something that I think Japan is concerned about, and so just from a sheer recognition of geography is concerned about. But I mean, if it does mean grand bargain with China, and therefore we don't even need an alliance system in Asia, then clearly that's a major wake up call and a crisis for Japan. And it's not, it's uncomfortable for Japan because it's not something that, if it happens with little warning, you get sort of a Trump shock, Nixon in 1971 style shock, then, almost overnight, you're going to get, almost, a feeling of panic in Tokyo, but maybe not a lot of good options. And, even for the all the discussion about, Japan as a latent nuclear power, as soon as you start looking at the details and the complexity of that, that is not something that, even, you hear sometimes like cavalier suggestions that it can be done in 6 months. I mean, it is not something that can happen easily. And in the meantime, what happens, during however many months it takes to have your own nuclear deterrent, what sort of coercion are you vulnerable to? So, it's such a drastic hypothetical that it's really hard. It's really hard to know, how does the Japanese public respond? How do Japanese elites respond? I mean, it's, certainly from the moment, it's very hard to imagine, Japan wanting to reach some sort of accommodation with China or some sort of, Finlandization, like, well, you leave us alone and, we won't make any trouble for you, in foreign policy. I mean, that's also hard to imagine. But, in a shock situation, the United States decides that it's pulling out. A lot of things that seem unthinkable now could become possible. And, there certainly will be people domestically in Japan arguing, do we want to really, pick up the sword essentially that the U.S. would be dropping down, and that's going to be a really tough debate domestically in Japan.
All right. Well, second hypothetical. Shinzo Abe and Donald Trump had a very close relationship. Donald Trump thought very highly of him. If he's still alive, does this look completely different? Or do you think that the way that Japan-U.S. relations have played out here in the first 6 months of the Trump administration would be fundamentally different if he had not been assassinated?
It's, it's a question I've obviously thought a lot about over the last 3 or 6 months. I tend to be skeptical, though, or at least tend to caution people not to have kind of rose-colored spectacles when it comes to looking back to Trump 1, where I think there was a period of time where, Abe's investments in a relationship with Trump paid dividends. The fact that he went to meet him right after right after he was elected, when no one else really knew what to do, and Abe got on a plane and went very quickly and met with him in Trump Tower. That I think won him a lot of credit. The early visit to Mar-a-Lago after inauguration, I think, got him a lot of credit. And so that in some ways maybe certainly delayed some things. It certainly maybe avoided more severe outcomes. But I would argue that you really got diminishing returns from that personal relationship as well. That by 2018, when Trump starts talking with North Korea, you get Abe calling up Trump constantly, please don't forget Japan, please don't forget Japan. And I don't think that worked with Trump personally. I think to the extent that Abe's sort of efforts to kind of prevent a bad deal with North Korea that would harm Japan, I think he had help inside the Trump administration. I think there's been reporting about John Bolton basically working with Abe to help prevent a deal that would basically let North Korea keep its nuclear weapons and basically get like a seal of approval for its arsenal. If that happened, if you saw similar talks happen now, would it look like that? Probably not. Even with Abe around, and also Abe really was not eager to get into a situation of doing U.S. Japan bilateral trade talks, and Trump threatens automobile tariffs, and what happens? Japan has to come to the table. So things weren't always as pleasant and cheerful and friendly as people remember. And Trump, of course, is perfectly capable of talking, is happy to talk about how much he likes this place or is friendly towards that place. But then we'll turn around and slap tariffs on a country, right? I mean, right before Liberation Day, what was it? Israel was saying, we'll take all U.S. tariff, all U.S. goods, duty free. And did it matter? No, it didn't matter. And, so there's clearly a limit, to how far personal diplomacy, what with Trump even during the first term. And clearly, I think during this term, he feels more confident. He won the popular vote last year, feels stronger. He's been there before. That this is not, he's not as, I think, susceptible to flattery maybe as he once was, or certainly also maybe is wilier and is willing to let those engaging in flattery think they're getting something from him, and ultimately, he, is happy to let them think that, but is ultimately not giving up anything in return. So I am not necessarily convinced that things would look different, right? That would the Liberation Day tariff, would Abe have been able to convince Trump to exempt Japan from those? I don't think so. Would the kind of, would Abe have been able to kind of navigate, the internal divisions, on trade that we've talked about in this conversation? Not necessarily. I mean, the people within, the Navarros and the Lutniks. I mean, would Abe be able to kind of, lean on the scale so that kind of they're overpowered and have to kind of make a friendlier deal with Japan just because, Abe could get Trump on the phone easily? I'm not convinced. I'm really not convinced. Things seem just very different this time around.
Yeah, I mean, the recent Musk-Trump drama shows you how quickly some of these things can change, no matter how much Trump seems to be having a bromance with someone. Which I think the Trump-Abe things felt a little bromancy. All right, let's move away from the United States. Let's talk a little bit about Japanese relations with China. In late December, you had Japan's foreign minister visit China. A couple interesting meetings. Also met China's foreign minister. You had some follow-up in March about, consensus points and pledging economic collaboration and things like that. At the same time, I mean, if you look just at, I looked at the South China Morning Post this morning, China's military saying Japan is breaching its pacifist constitution with long-range missile tests. So it's not like everything is perfect. you also, I mean, I don't know if these reports were ever confirmed, but about, South Korea, Japan, and China coordinating some kind of response to U.S. tariffs. Like that was sort of denied by one side, maybe by one side, and no, this has, it's sort of all over the place there. So where do where do Japan-China relations stand from your point of view? Have they gotten better? Is it basically still the same? Are they in flux? Like where are they?
No, that when everyone kind of freaked out about the that Japan, China, South Korea, based on Chinese state media reporting. I mean, that was really ridiculous. But anyway, it's this predates Trump. I mean, you really have had efforts, really going back a year now, by the Japanese government to try to repair some of the damage. Things were. It's been this roller coaster, right? Under second Abe, things started out really poorly, and a lot of military tensions and wars of words and battles over history, and then by 2016, 2017, not coincidentally, after Trump takes office, I mean, you did have Abe really investing in trying to improve the economic relationship with China, get on the same page, find opportunities for cooperation. And, to the point where, in 2020, had COVID not happened, Xi Jinping was supposed to visit, to visit Japan on a state visit. So that was sort of where things were. And then COVID happened, and China, what came down heavy on Hong Kong, and there was a real backlash to that in Japan, and that really soured things. And you've had just worse, trade friction with the United States, and the Biden administration's approach, and Japan tagging along with that. And so you've just had this decline now for the last 4 or 5 years, and now they're at this point now of, okay, how do we undo some of that damage? Which not only is it levying this export control and foregoing this visit and announcing this military exercise with this country, just like the series of steps that really have heightened tensions. I mean, it's also just trying to restore channels of communication. I mean, that really is, I think, the most important thing we've seen over the last year. It's been less about tangible improvement, which has been very halting, and has been more about how do you get getting Japanese political leaders back to China, who used to have these kind of regular delegations going over and having communication. How do you get business delegations going back? How do you then have Communist Party officials coming on visits to Japan, Chinese government officials back to Japan, just restarting some of these exchanges, so the exchange of views are there. And I mean, and that really, I mean, I think that has been the most important thing. Really going back to basically roughly September of last year, you've now had a series of exchanges. Things seem much more routinized. The communication is happening, even if just getting over some of the real challenges is proving very difficult. They're at least talking to each other.
Well, let's sort of stay in the same vein and say also there's been a big election in South Korea over the last couple of weeks. We've got, is progressive too strong? I mean, you've got a South Korean leader now who you would think is going to maybe revamp some of the previous South Korean administration's approach. So that administration basically tried to put to bed conflict with Japan, tried to deepen relations with both the United States and Japan trilaterally. I think President Biden, one of the things he got the least amount of credit for was the way that he really ironed out some of those disagreements between Japan and South Korea. Now, he had a favorable South Korean government to do it, but hey, he knew it was an issue. He tried. It was sort of a major success story for him. Does all that go away? Early returns from the South Korean government suggest that maybe a little more pragmatic than the progressive label looks. Maybe they want to continue to deepen or at least keep relations with Japan and with the United States fairly good. Do you see any imminent change there? I mean, there's been also some things about maybe South Korea and North Korea relaxing things a little bit. And you can imagine if we return to Fire and Fury and Rocket Man, we'll put that we'll put that VHS back in and start replaying some of the Trump 1 episodes from that sort of thing. So, and is this a source of optimism for Japan? Is this oh no, not this too, like the sky is falling? Is it somewhere in between? How do we think about it?
Oh, well, it for the moment, I mean, President Lee has been saying the right things, and on the campaign trail, was saying the right things. And, um, but in general, you know, when you have, um, in I mean, the situation, it's not quite like, when Moon Jae-in was president, but the last time you had a progressive Korean president, right? Because then you had a progressive Korean president and a pretty right-wing Japanese prime minister in Prime Minister Abe, and you essentially got this sort of escalatory spiral on history issues as a result of that. In part because you had kind of each leader's domestic base was essentially pushing them away from pushing the two countries apart. And so the question is, circumstances are a little different now, and in part also because I think views in South Korea have changed, maybe even less about Japan and more about fears of China. I think are pretty well ingrained. I think one of the things that Japanese elites, and particularly more right-wing Japanese elites, have been convinced of is China, South Korea, they're too close to China. They're not a reliable partner when it comes to security in the region. We can't trust them, and so therefore it's not worth investing any real effort in trying to get along with them anyway. And I think the mood in Tokyo maybe has changed a little bit on that. There's a little more willingness to see that, okay, maybe the South Korean people as a whole are skeptical of China. They are, that there is the material for kind of broader security cooperation on that. So that might be in the backdrop of the kind of new tone that we've heard from President Lee. I mean, the question, in all of this is, I mean, it's easy to say it on the campaign trail. It's easy to say it now after you've been, elected and inaugurated. The question is when something happens that tests the relationship, what then? Do you grandstand for your core supporters, or, do you do shuttle diplomacy, and try to get to a situation where cooler heads can prevail, and you can say the relationship is bigger than this. We have to. We can't let a legal case about history, something historical or historical claims derail cooperation about other issues, or more kind of tangible future looking cooperation. And it's until we actually see something like that happen, that remains to be seen. I mean, in some ways, it's not bad that Prime Minister Ishiba is in power, in that he has in a Japan context on as far as relations with Korea go. I mean, he's relatively progressive about it. I mean, has been he has called for much more reckoning by Japanese with what Japan actually did in Korea. It's something that makes him not particularly, especially popular with the right wing of his own party. It'll be interesting to see. This is of course a big anniversary year, both for the being the 60th anniversary of normalization or establishment of diplomatic relations between Japan and South Korea. Of course, it's also the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, and Ishiba has made noise about wanting to put out some sort of statement. It's not clear what sort of legal status that statement will have. I mean, and there's debate, it's been a pretty lengthy debate in Japan about what kind of statement Ishiba will be able to make. But, there's some opportunity there for, a prime minister like Ishiba to maybe say some things on these occasions that, can maybe disarm some South Korean skepticism or hostility towards Japan. Having a prime minister say that. I mean, the problem for Ishiba, of course, is that as long as his political situation is a little weak, he may be limited in what he can say for fear of backlash from his right. And so that's something to consider. I mean, and he might be the right person, but is not necessarily in a position where he can just say whatever he wants without fearing for political consequences. So maybe ultimately for the long term stability of the bilateral relationship, the best thing would have been if someone like Abe could have made some sort of more kind of deeper, heartfelt gesture with a Korean progressive in power, and that might have maybe resulted in some sort of more durable kind of settlement. But so the potential for friction is there. Even with Lee saying the right things. There's still plenty of hostility in both countries, waiting to be inflamed. So yeah, that's really the thing to watch for. Is there a catalyst at some point that really undoes some of the work that we've seen?
That's cautiously hopeful, if I'm reading your tone correctly. Let's pivot a little bit now to Japanese domestic politics. At your advice, I'm slowly working my way through The Nobility of Failure by Ivan Morris. Loving it, by the way. And the last time we talked, you mentioned that maybe Ishiba would be a chapter in this book in the future. And things did not seem to be going particularly well at the beginning. We could talk about rice prices. We could talk about terrible approval ratings, potential votes of no confidence. But he seems to have turned the ship around a little bit. Like, his approval ratings starting to inch up. You've got some pretty good pushes on trying to lower rice prices. You've got some deals with the opposition about pension reform. So where are you at with Ishiba? Do you think fundamentally the deck is stacked against him? Is he turning it around? Is he still going to be the tragic hero? Like, how are we feeling a couple months in?
Yeah, it's things really have changed week to week. That there have been moments in the last few months where things were looking better, and then just when things start looking up, that's when the rug seems to get pulled out under him. So we'll see if this is really a true new beginning for him, or if it's just another false dawn. But the story really for Ishiba, I mean, his premiership now has been fundamentally shaped by the fact that he is at the head of a minority government, and everything has to be negotiated. Everything requires consulting with multiple opposition parties, trying to convince at least one of them to support something that his government wants to do. And predictably, what that has done has forced him to scale back his ambitions. And the criticism, even and especially from within the LDP, has been, well, we don't know what he wants to do. He has not really laid out a vision. And I mean, and some of that is just he's kind of a different sort of politician, for doing like the kind of fox and hedgehog dichotomy. Abe in a lot of ways was something of a hedgehog in that, was like absolutely fixated on this idea of kind of national greatness and, make Japan great again. Perhaps we might call it, that all out effort to make Japan stronger, to make Japan wealthier, to leave behind the frustrations and the difficulties of the lost decades, to make Japan powerful and relevant. That's not kind of how Ishiba is. Ishiba is much more fox-like, much less animated by this sort of big obsessive vision, much more adapting, responsive. He's not terribly ideological ultimately. And so it's just a reason, in some ways it makes him well suited to this situation where he has to negotiate and he has to be willing to compromise and, be extremely flexible on what he's willing to concede on when it comes to negotiating on policies with the opposition. But it does mean that we just don't know. There's not a huge vision that he's going to put all of his effort into trying to achieve. I mean, there really is just a sense of he's just trying to survive here as long as he can and sort of walk this tightrope, and hope it works out. And for people who are used to watching, expecting a leader to be like Abe and to lay out this grand vision, and this is what we're working towards, even if there's going to be momentary zigs and zags. That's not what you're getting with Ishiba, and so that's just the difference. He's got his big test in about a month when there'll be upper house elections, and basically, it really will be make or break for his government, because if the LDP cannot hold, or if the ruling coalition cannot hold the upper house majority they have now, it's very hard to see how Ishiba survives that. So, we'll have to revisit things in a few weeks and see if he's still if he's still around, because everything for him is going to be riding on that.
Talk to us a little bit to close out about rice, because probably most listeners don't realize what a big story this is in sort of the Japanese political context. Also a place where Ishiba has some sort of interesting, like you said, not ideological, but seems to me he's always had agriculture in the back of his mind, something that he's soft on, and obviously has experience there too. So tell the listeners what's going on in Japanese rice politics and why it's so important, and maybe it'll determine his fate in those elections that you just talked about.
It could. It certainly. It certainly, I think, is now an important determinant of his approval ratings. So we've seen over the last year. Really, it started with shortages that appeared last summer, where you had some bare shelves and stores were getting cleaned out of rice. And it was a lot of different factors. Some of it was climate change resulting in sort of a poorer than expected crop. There has been a long-term secular decline in Japanese rice consumption, that people just are not eating as much as they used to. It's still an absolute staple of the Japanese diet, but it's what Japanese people eat now is more diversified than in the past. So relatively speaking, they're just consuming less rice, and so you've had that, and as a result, the farmers are kind of factoring that into their calculations when it comes to acreage. And of course, the Japanese government is still, despite reforms in the past, is still paying farmers not to grow. So there's not a lot of flexibility in the production system. Another factor that's been cited is that just with the tourism boom, you have lots of foreigners coming, and even if the Japanese people are eating less rice, well, you have all these foreigners come who want to come and eat sushi and want to eat all this, they want to eat the rice. So you had shortages last year, and then you just have prices, steadily start rising. And, we saw prices in April doubled 98% year over year. And that was, sort of now like the peak. And that really put this at the center of the agenda. It's been sort of rising in importance. And with that, it was, wow, okay. Like this is, people really are struggling with this. And also because it's such an important component in a lot of other food, it was fueling higher than, higher than the 2% inflation target, inflation steadily, because you have this expensive input now that is making other things more expensive, or at least, among, depending on which type of inflation you're looking at. So, clearly a problem, clearly contributing to cost of living increases that your households are feeling. And somewhat fortuitously for Ishiba, his agriculture minister had a Marie, literally people were calling him Marie Antoinette for saying this, saying that, I get so much rice for free from my supporters that I don't have to buy any rice, and not something that went over terribly well with the public. And so after a couple of days, he was axed, and the popular Koizumi Shinjiro was brought in to be agriculture minister. And with that, the government basically announced an entirely new approach to this problem of rising rice prices. They've been releasing rice from government stockpiles for several months now, but the system that they were using to do that was auctions. And basically what was happening was that you would be having these, you'd have the auctions to buy government stockpiled rice, and people would be buying, that basically wholesalers or suppliers would be buying it and then holding on to it, with the assuming that, okay, well, if we just hold on to it, the way prices are going, we'll just sell it, for more, in a month or two. And so, they recognized that approach wasn't working. And so what Koizumi announced basically the day he took office was that they were going to start making deals with major retailers directly and start selling from the government stockpiles directly to the retailers. And there was basically a stampede of major retailers to sign up for this. And it's pulled very well. And the rice is now starting to arrive in stores, and overall rice prices are starting to tick down. So far that looks like they've maybe turned a corner. I mean, it looks like a really successful reboot of their rice policy. There are now bigger structural questions because lower rice prices, well, who doesn't like lower rice prices? The rice producers that are also an important LDP constituent. So, we're starting to see the beginnings of a bigger debate about Japanese agricultural policy. How do you, how should you subsidize farmers? How you should protect farmers? Should they just stop discouraging them from planting rice altogether, let them plant more, but really do export promotion and really start trying to sell Japanese rice overseas, have other sort of subsidies. And so that debate is to come and will be, I think, a major issue after the upper house election. But for now, the focus really is how do you get more rice into stores and bring prices down? And, so far so good for Ishiba and Koizumi.
I think sometimes people operate under the misapprehension that geopolitics is all about great powers and the U.S. and Japan and China and South Korea, when I actually think it's really more about rice prices. I think if you really want to understand things about politics, it's all local, and probably the more local and the more it hurts, like local interests, the more you're actually going to understand what's happening next. Tobias, thanks, man. I find Japan, are you finding you're getting more interest in people in Japan? Because for a long time, I feel like Japan has been this, I don't know, not a black box, but it's like I understand China better than I understand Japan because there's just more access to information readily in English about it, and it's like less. I don't know. It's easier to read. Have you noticed a significant uptick in interest in what you're doing, or is it still relatively quiet when it comes to Japan?
No, I think there is. I think and probably that'll probably only continue to grow just as the shape and the patterns of the global economy continue to change. I mean, I think Japan is well positioned in important ways. I think, for better or worse too, just as money flows shift and as the global bond market shifts, we're seeing maybe interest, maybe concern about Japan. I mean, all of that I think is now weighing on people's minds. So, no, definitely I have noticed, for my business, Japan Foresight, have definitely noticed more interest, more inquiries about it. And I welcome those inquiries, of course. But it feels like a good time to be watching Japan.
Yeah. All right. Well, hopefully we'll have you back on soon. Thanks, man.